Okay, so, we're hearing so much these days about the big shift in energy, right? Like moving away from fossil fuels to more sustainable options. And I think a lot of people, when they first think about that, they're like, oh yeah, solar panels and wind turbines, but there's more to it than that, especially when you start thinking about all these electric vehicles that are showing up everywhere.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
When you dig a little deeper, you realize it's not just about where the energy comes from. It's also about how we actually use it, how we manage it.
Mm.
And especially with all these electric cars hitting the road, that's a whole other layer of complexity and opportunity.
It really is. And that's what we're going to kind of unpack today. I mean, we're diving deep into a really interesting study here.
Yeah, it's a fascinating piece of research. The full title is a bit of a mouthful. It's called Role of Smart Charging of Electric Vehicles and Vehicle to Grid in Integrated Renewables-Based Energy Systems on Country Level.
Yeah, that's what we'll probably just call it this study as we go along. But just to be clear up front, this isn't some, super technical report that's only for engineers or something.
Not at all.
I think anyone who's maybe thought about getting an EV or wondered how our power grid is going to handle, everyone plugging in their cars at the same time, or even just anyone who likes to be in the know about where our energy future is headed, I think they'll find something pretty interesting in this study.
Absolutely. And what I found really fascinating about this study is that it focuses on how those batteries in EVs, through these technologies called smart charging and V2G, which is vehicle to grid, can actually become this really powerful tool for building a cleaner, more resilient energy future. And that's what we're going to break down for you.
Yeah. So our mission today is to kind of extract the key insights, maybe even a few aha moments from the study. Keep it understandable, keep it feeling like we're just having a conversation about this stuff because it really is interesting.
It is.
So maybe just to set the stage, what's the big picture here? Like what kind of energy world is this study painting a picture of? What's the context for all of this?
So we've been relying on fossil fuels for well over a century, and that's obviously got to change. This study kind of highlights that we are now in this fundamental transition, this really big shift towards energy systems that are not only carbon neutral, but also sustainable for the long haul. And this isn't just happening in one sector. It involves a growing integration, kind of weaving together of different parts of our energy system. Think about electricity generation, how we heat our homes, transportation, even industrial processes. They're all starting to become much more interconnected.
Yeah, it used to be pretty separate, right? You had your power plants over here and your gas stations and then your furnace in your basement. But now with electric cars and heat pumps and all that, it's like everything's starting to plug into the same system.
Exactly.
It's all getting kind of, yeah, linked up.
Right. And the reasons for this shift are pretty clear. I mean, we've got the environmental concerns, everything from air pollution to the climate crisis. We're also, eventually we are going to run out of those fossil fuels. But something that's really accelerated this whole transition, and which this study kind of takes as a given, is that the cost of renewable energy technologies has dropped dramatically, especially for solar and wind power.
Yeah, I remember when solar panels were like this kind of niche, super expensive thing, and now they're like popping up everywhere. It's amazing how quickly the prices come down.
Absolutely. And the study does mention other technologies like nuclear power and carbon capture and storage. Those are still kind of in the mix. But the reality is that renewables, especially solar and wind, are being installed at a much faster rate. And that's making renewable electricity not just the primary energy source, but also the cheapest one.
Which makes a huge difference, right? Because if it's cheaper, everyone wants to use it.
Of course.
Okay, so that sets the stage, but let's zoom in a bit. Let's talk electric vehicles, because that's a big part of this whole story. We're seeing more and more of them on the roads. What's the opportunity here, but also what's the potential challenge that this study is digging into?
Well, the adoption of electric vehicles, whether they're fully electric or plug-in hybrids, and this study looks at both, it's just booming globally. I mean, you see
Yeah.
particularly high sales in developed countries. In China, the number of EVs on the road is just growing rapidly. And that's fantastic news in terms of reducing emissions. But it also presents a potential challenge for our existing power grids, for the infrastructure we have in place.
Right, because you're essentially adding millions of new devices that all need to suck up a lot of electricity.
Exactly. The total demand for electricity is going to rise. And right now, the way most people charge their EVs, They get home from work, they plug in their car, maybe they're cooking dinner, turning on the AC, all that stuff. That typically happens in the late afternoon or evening. And that happens to be when electricity demand is already at its peak.
Oh, yeah, that's true. Everyone's doing laundry, making dinner, watching TV, and now we're going to add charging our cars on top of that.
Exactly. And that could lead to some serious strain on the grid. The study even shows these typical residential electricity demand patterns, for example, in Germany.
Yeah.
And you see these really pronounced peaks in the morning and evening, and EV charging on top of that could really exacerbate those peaks.
That makes sense. Okay, so basically, if we just keep doing things the way we're used to, everyone plugs in their car when they get home, we could be heading for some big problems.
Exactly.
So how do we fix that?
That's where this concept of flexibility comes in, and this is really central to what this study's all about. If you've got an energy system that's increasingly reliant on renewable sources, things like solar and wind power, you need flexibility to balance that out because the supply of those renewables, it's not always constant.
Right. The sun isn't always shining. The wind isn't always blowing.
Exactly. So we need ways to match that variable supply with our demand for electricity, which isn't always that flexible either. And this study outlines several ways we can achieve this flexibility. Things like flexible power generation, where power plants can ramp up and down quickly, energy storage like big batteries, a smarter grid that can move electricity around more efficiently, and even getting different sectors to work together, like using excess renewable energy to produce hydrogen, for example.
So it's kind of like a puzzle, right? You've got all these pieces that need to fit together in the right way.
Exactly. And one piece of this puzzle that this study focuses on is electric vehicles. More specifically, the batteries inside those vehicles.
Okay, so my car battery can be more than just, a way to store energy to drive my car.
That's right. We can actually use them to provide some of that flexibility we need in the larger energy system.
How does that actually work?
Well, let's start with something called smart charging, sometimes also called grid-to-vehicle or V1G.
Yeah.
To understand that, it helps to compare it to what's called dump charging.
Dump charging, what's that?
Dump charging is essentially what happens now when you plug in your EV and it just starts charging immediately at the highest possible rate.
It just goes for it.
Exactly. No regard for the state of the grid, no consideration of electricity prices, none of that. It's like plugging in your phone.
Right, you just expect it to start charging.
Precisely. Smart charging is different. Smart charging means having some level of control over the EV's charging power and adjusting that charging based on things like electricity supply and costs at that particular time. So maybe instead of charging at full speed right when you plug in, your car waits until later in the night when there's more renewable energy available on the grid or when electricity prices are lower.
So it's like my car is communicating with the grid and making smart decisions about when to charge up.
Exactly. And the study highlights that this can have significant benefits. For one, it can help reduce those peak loads we were talking about, which is huge. It can also potentially lower CO2 emissions because you can incentivize charging when cleaner energy sources are more abundant on the grid. And on top of that, you, as an EV owner, could potentially save money on your electricity bill by shifting your charging to off-peak hours.
That sounds pretty good, like a win-win situation.
Right, it benefits the grid, it benefits the environment, and it can even save you money.
Okay, so that's smart charging. But I know this study goes a step further, right? They talk about something called vehicle to grid, or V2G, where your car can actually send power back to the grid.
That's right. V2G is kind of the next level. It's not just about controlling when your car charges, it's about actually using your car battery to support the grid. So imagine this. Not only can your EV draw power from the grid to charge its battery, but it can also discharge energy stored in its battery back to the grid when there's a high demand for electricity or if there's a shortage in supply.
Whoa, so my car could actually become like a little mini power plant, like a backup generator almost.
In a way, yes. It's like having a distributed network of energy storage all over the place, right there in people's garages and driveways.
That's wild.
And it's different from those big centralized battery storage facilities because it's much closer to the consumers, often right there at the level of the local distribution grid.
Okay, so that makes a lot of sense. But I guess the question is, how realistic is this? Like, is V2G something that could actually work in practice?
That's a good question. V2G does require specific hardware in the EVs themselves. The cars need to be able to deliver that high-quality alternating current back to the grid. Right now, not all EV manufacturers equip their vehicles with that capability, though more are starting to offer it. And there's also the question of business models, like who pays for this? How do EV owners get compensated for providing this service to the grid?
Yeah, those are all important details.
Right. The business models are still evolving, but it's something that needs to be figured out. And this study does acknowledge those challenges. The study also mentioned something called vehicle to home, or V2H, where your EV could actually power your own house, which could be really helpful during a power outage, for example.
Oh, that's really interesting. I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah, there are a lot of possibilities.
Okay, so we've talked about the big picture energy transition, the rise of EVs, the need for flexibility, and these ideas of smart charging and V2G. But now let's get to the heart of the matter. What did this study actually find?
So this study really aimed to address this gap in the research. We know EVs are becoming a big deal, but how do they actually impact the larger energy system, especially in a world powered by renewables?
Right, because it's one thing to have these technologies, but it's another thing to understand how they actually affect things on a large scale.
Exactly. So what the researchers did is they used this really sophisticated tool called the LUT Energy System Transition Model, and they modified it to specifically incorporate smart charging in VDG. This model simulates all the different parts of an energy system, power generation, heating, transportation, industry, in really fine detail. Like it looks at things on an hourly basis over a really long period of time.
So it's not just looking at, one piece in isolation, it's looking at how everything interacts with everything else.
Exactly. And because it's an optimization model,
Hmm.
it tries to figure out the most cost-effective way to meet all our energy needs while transitioning to a system based primarily on renewable energy. The study looked at various scenarios, each with different levels of flexibility, enabled by smart charging and VDG. And one of the key findings, one that I think will be really interesting for you to know, is that in countries with a lot of electric vehicles, smart charging and V2G can significantly reduce the need for traditional energy storage solutions like big battery farms or pumped hydro.
So instead of building all these massive batteries, we can use the batteries that are already in our cars.
That's right. It's like tapping into a resource that's already there. And the study found that this could lead to substantial cost savings. They estimated that the required capacity for electricity and heat storage could be reduced by 35% and 25% respectively.
Wow, that's huge. I mean, that's a lot less infrastructure we need to build.
Exactly. And that translates to about a 4% reduction in the overall cost of the energy system.
4% might not sound like a lot, but when you're talking about a whole country's energy system, that's billions of dollars in savings.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's pretty impressive.
Mhm.
But they also looked at other flexibility options, right? Like using electrolyzers in a more flexible way. What did they find there?
So electrolyzers, as you know, are used to produce hydrogen, which can be used for various things like clean fuels. And the study found that if we operate these electrolyzers more flexibly, we can achieve similar reductions in the need for energy storage. And when you combine flexible electrolyzers with smart charging and VDG, the potential cost savings become even greater, up to 8%, according to the study.
Wow, so it's like all these different pieces of the puzzle can work together to create a more efficient and more affordable energy system?
Exactly. And the study highlights that even though VDG would have some operational costs, things like wear and tear on batteries,
Hmm.
managing the system, it still contributes to overall cost reduction, even if those costs are relatively high. They looked at costs in the range of 50 to 100 euros per megawatt hour, and even then it was still beneficial.
So it's not like V2G has to be perfectly free to be worthwhile. It's got some wiggle room.
Right. It can still be a valuable tool even with some real-world costs.
Okay, so you mentioned different scenarios. Can you walk us through those? Like, what were the researchers trying to understand by comparing these different scenarios?
Sure. They looked at 6 main scenarios, each building on the previous one by adding more flexibility options. The first one, they called it the base scenario. It's basically a future with the least amount of flexibility, with limited flexibility for hydrogen production and no smart charging, or V2G for EVs.
So that's kind of like the business as usual scenario where we don't really change much.
Exactly. Then they added smart charging for EVs to that base scenario and called it base MCH. And then they added V2G on top of that and called it base V2G.
So those scenarios are basically showing us what happens when we start adding those technologies to the mix.
Right. And they looked at flexible operation of those hydrogen-producing electrolyzers. They called that scenario Flex. Then they combined Flex with smart charging for EVs and called it Flex MCH.
Okay, so they're gradually adding more and more flexibility to the system.
Exactly. And finally, they had this really ambitious scenario. They called it Flex V2G BPS, which stands for best policy scenario.
So that's like the ultimate goal,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Like if we did everything right, this is what the energy system could look like.
That's the idea. In this flex V2G scenario, they included flexible electrolyzers, smart charging, and V2G all together. It's the scenario that gives the energy system the most tools to balance the fluctuating supply of renewable energy.
Okay, so that gives us a good overview of the different scenarios. Now let's dig into some specifics. What did they find about the impact on energy storage?
So this is one of the most striking findings in the study. They found that even just implementing smart charging on its own can already significantly reduce the need for those large-scale battery storage facilities.
That's interesting. So even without V2G, we can already make a big difference just by making EV charging smarter.
It's exactly. By the 2040s, they projected a reduction of around 25% in required electricity storage capacity. And even by 2050, which is further out, it's still a significant 10% reduction.
Mm.
And then when you add V2G on top of that, the total reduction in battery storage capacity jumps to around 35% in the period from 2040 to 2050. That's equivalent to needing about 390 gigawatt hours less battery storage capacity in the year 2050.
That's massive. I mean, that's like a whole bunch of power plants we don't have to build.
Right. And that translates to real cost savings.
Makes sense. What about flexible electrolyzers? What was their impact on storage needs?
They also found that flexible operation of electrolyzers has a big impact, especially by 2050. They projected that flexible electrolyzers alone could reduce electricity storage capacity by 33%. And when you combine that with all the flexibility options, smart charging, V2G, and flexible electrolyzers, that reduction jumps to a whopping 55% by 2050.
So basically, we can really optimize how we use storage if we leverage both the demand side and the supply side of the equation. And they also looked at thermal energy storage, right? Because that's important for heating.
That's right. They found that the same flexibility options, smart charging, V2G, flexible electrolyzers, can also lead to reductions in thermal energy storage requirements. And in the context of producing synthetic methane, flexible operation of electrolyzers can also help optimize methane storage, allowing for a better match between production and demand.
Okay, so it's not just about electricity storage, it's about optimizing all kinds of storage across the energy system. What about the actual supply of electricity itself? Did they find anything interesting about that?
Yeah, one thing that stood out is how these flexibility options can significantly reduce curtailment of renewable energy.
Curtailment. Remind me what that is again.
So curtailment is when you have to essentially waste renewable energy because there's no demand for it at that particular time and nowhere to store it. It happens sometimes when you have a lot of solar or wind power, but the grid can't handle it.
Oh, right. Like if the wind is blowing really strong, but everyone's asleep and not using much electricity.
Exactly. So this study found that smart charging and VDG can help reduce that curtailment by quite a bit. Basically, if you can shift EV charging to times when there's an abundance of solar or wind power, or even use EV batteries to absorb that excess energy, you're going to waste less of it.
Makes sense. Use it or lose it.
Right. They also found that in some scenarios, V2G could actually lead to a slight increase in the overall amount of electricity generation.
Really? I thought the whole point was to use less energy.
It's a bit counterintuitive, but it has to do with the geographical distribution of renewable energy sources and EVs.
Okay, so it's not always a simple equation of reducing everything across the board.
Exactly. It's about finding the optimal balance.
Speaking of balance, we haven't really talked about the electricity grid itself, the infrastructure that carries all this electricity around. What did this study say about the impact of these technologies on the grid?
So one thing they found is that for the scenarios they modeled, the existing grid capacity was mostly sufficient to handle the transition to 100% renewables. They did project that some upgrades would be needed by 2050, but not massive overhauls.
That's good to know. It's not like we have to completely rebuild the grid from scratch.
Right.
But what about the impact of smart charging and V2G specifically?
So they found that smart charging and flexible operation of electrolyzers generally led to a decrease in the required grid capacity and throughput, meaning less electricity needs to be transmitted.
That makes sense because you're basically smoothing out the demand, right?
Exactly. But V2G, when implemented on its own, could potentially increase grid capacity needs a bit, likely because of how EVs and renewable generation are distributed geographically, as we were discussing earlier. But the important thing is that when they combined all the flexibility measures, smart charging, V2G, and flexible electrolyzers, they actually found the potential for reduced energy losses in the high-voltage transmission grid.
So it's like a holistic approach. If we do all these things together, we can make the grid more efficient overall.
Exactly.
Okay, now let's talk money. What about the economic impact of all of this? We heard earlier about potential cost savings for the whole system, but how does this translate to the price you and I actually pay for our electricity?
Well, the study found that introducing these flexibility options consistently led to a lower overall cost for the energy system and the supply of energy. So in theory, that should translate to lower costs for consumers.
That's what we like to hear.
Right. And remember how I mentioned that flexible operation of electrolyzers had a particularly big impact on reducing overall system costs?
Yeah.
Well, they also looked at the levelized cost of electricity, or LCOE, which is essentially the average cost of producing electricity over the lifetime of a power plant. And they found that these flexibility options primarily impacted the costs related to energy storage and curtailment of renewables.
Okay, so we're basically saving money by needing less storage and wasting less renewable energy.
Exactly. Now, here's something interesting. They found that the impact of smart charging and V2G on reducing the cost of those clean e-fuels was actually greater than their impact on reducing the LCOE of electricity itself.
Oh, interesting. Why is that?
It has to do with how these technologies can improve the utilization of the facilities that produce those e-fuels. It's a bit technical, but basically they can run more efficiently.
Okay, so we're not just making electricity cheaper, we're also making clean fuels more affordable. That's a big deal.
Absolutely.
Now, of course, we can't forget about the environmental impact. What did this study say about CO2 emissions?
So they found that, as expected, these flexibility options can help reduce CO2 emissions. They enable us to transition to renewables faster and reduce our dependence on fossil fuels.
Makes sense.
But they also pointed out that the impact on cumulative emissions over the entire transition period was less dramatic.
Meaning what we've already emitted.
Exactly. A lot of those emissions have already happened, and these technologies mainly help reduce future emissions.
Okay, so it's not a magic bullet for fixing everything that's already been done, but it's a crucial tool for preventing things from getting worse.
Exactly.
Now, before we wrap up, I have one more question that I know a lot of EV owners might be thinking about.
Sure, what is it?
What's the incentive for actually participating in V2G? Like, it sounds great for the grid, but is there any benefit for me as an EV owner? Won't it wear down my battery faster?
Those are valid concerns.
Yeah.
The study acknowledges that some incentives will likely be needed to encourage people to participate in V2G programs. They explored the idea of compensating EV owners based on how much electricity they send back to the grid. Essentially, you'd get paid for providing this service.
Oh, that's interesting. So it could actually be a way to make some money with your car?
Exactly. And what's really interesting is that they found that V2G can still be economically beneficial for the overall energy system, even if those payments to EV owners are relatively high.
So even if it costs something, it's still worth it.
Right. Because it helps optimize the whole system and ultimately reduces costs for everyone.
Okay, so that's pretty reassuring.
It is.
So as we start wrapping up our deep dive into this study, role of smart charging of electric vehicles and vehicle-to-grid in integrated renewables-based energy systems on country level.
That's a mouthful.
I know, right? But what would you say are the key takeaways for our listeners? What should they remember from all of this?
Well, I think the main takeaway is that smart charging and V2G have huge potential to be key players in the transition to a renewable energy future. They're not just technologies, they're enablers.
Yeah, they're tools that can help us make this whole thing work.
Exactly.
Uh,
And another important point is that flexibility is crucial, and it has to come from multiple sources. It's not just about EVs, it's about making all parts of the energy system more flexible.
so it's like a team effort. Everyone has to play their part.
Exactly. And finally, the study provides really strong evidence that these technologies can have significant economic and environmental benefits.
They can make the system cheaper, cleaner, and more resilient.
Precisely.
So it's not just about switching to electric cars, it's about how we use them, how we integrate them into the grid in a smart way.
Exactly. And I think that's a really exciting prospect.
It is, and this study really highlights the potential,
It does. It shows us that we can significantly reduce our need for traditional energy storage, which is expensive, and we can achieve substantial cost savings by doing so.
And all of that while moving towards a cleaner energy future.
Precisely.
So I think this leaves us with a lot to think about,
It does. And maybe a good question for everyone listening is, what can we do in our own communities, in our own countries to make this happen? What kind
Right.
of policies or incentives could we put in place to encourage the adoption of smart charging in V2G?
Those are great questions. And for anyone who wants to dig deeper into this topic, I'd recommend checking out some of the latest research on smart charging and V2G. There are some really exciting developments happening in this field.
Definitely. This is an area that's evolving rapidly.
Well, thanks for joining us today for this deep dive into role of smart charging of electric vehicles and vehicle to grid in integrated renewables-based energy systems on country level.
I told you it was a mouthful.
I know, right? But I hope this conversation has given you a better understanding of the crucial role that electric vehicles can play in our energy future.
I think so too. They're not just about transportation anymore.
They're about creating a more sustainable energy system for everyone.
Exactly.
Thanks again for listening.